This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. On June 7th, 1992, three women, 47-year-old Sherrill Levitt, her daughter, 19-year-old Suzanne Streeter, and Suzanne's friend, 18-year-old Stacy McCall, disappeared. Stacy and Suzanne, or Susie, had just graduated from high school hours beforehand, and were last seen driving home after attending a graduation party nearby. Sherrill had spoken to a friend on the phone that evening, and was having herself a quiet night in. Despite indications that all three had been inside of Sherrill's home that evening, all three vanished without a trace. In June of 2007, the 15-year mark of this strange case, a blog was published. Written by Ron Davis, it read as follows. The house is easy to miss. Just to its east is Glenstone Avenue, a clogged main drag. To the west, the homes get bigger, the neighborhood gets fancier, and so there is little reason to pay any attention to the one story at 1717 East Delmar Street. But the unremarkable house is home to the most remarkable crime in Springfield history. 15 years ago Thursday, a mother and two teens were taken from the house on Delmar, and no one has seen them since. Anyone living in Springfield 15 years ago will remember that summer for its frustrating intensity. Search teams in the fields, a police command post in front of the house, daily stories on the front page of the newspaper and the top of every TV newscast. Most everyone we knew then thought the missing would eventually be found. A hunter or hiker would stumble over remains. A bad guy would confess. Something would break and the lost would be found. A week passed, then a month. A year, 5, 10. Now this, a 15th anniversary, a milestone that in happiness is marked with crystal. This sad anniversary gets the media treatment. The next time you hear of Sherrill Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, it will be June 7th, 2012. While his final guess wasn't technically correct, the overall sentiment was. That year, 2007, the 15th mark of this strange disappearance came and went without any real fanfare. No arrest. No resolution. 5 years later, Susie and Stacy's 20-year high school reunion came and went. Still nothing. 5 years after that, the same thing. Now, in 2024, more than 3 decades after these three women vanished into thin air, answers remain elusive in this mystifying case. This is the story of the Springfield Three. Part 5. Closure. In January of 1998, authorities in Stone County, Missouri were called out to a sinkhole where the well-preserved remains of a young woman were found in an 18-foot deep pit, having been killed elsewhere and then dumped there. Based on the state of the remains, she had been there for at least 5 years. Authorities believed this could have been any of the missing women in the region, but police in Springfield were curious about a potential match for either Suzanne Streeter or Stacy McCall, hoping that these remains could help shed light on the region's most frustrating cold case. They were sadly incorrect. That same year, on the 6-year mark of the disappearance, police searched a rural farm in Texas County. For that, they were joined by members of the FBI, the Missouri Highway Patrol, and the County Sheriff's Department, with Lieutenant Steve Hamilton of the Springfield PD telling reporters, "We believed this could have been the one lead to solve it." It wasn't. Later, in December of 1998, police in Taney County came upon the skeletal remains of a young woman in a wooded area near Rockaway Beach. The remains, like some of the other evidence recovered at the scene, were well weathered, having been there for what looked like several years. The woman appeared to have been in her late teens or early 20s, and had been killed at the scene with what was determined to be a single bullet to the back of the head. Just like the remains found earlier that year, a connection to one of the younger victims in the Springfield 3 disappearance was theorized, but ultimately ruled out. After this onslaught of disappointments, detectives in Springfield aimed to relaunch their investigation into the disappearance of Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall in 2001, as the 10-year mark of the case approached. Steve I. James of the SPD would oversee the effort, later telling the Springfield News Leader, "That's a very, very touchy case for us. We didn't handle it perfectly at first, so some of the blame falls on us." In 2002, investigators received information about a pair of men that had worked for a concrete company at the time of the women's abduction, who had reportedly left town a short time later. It was claimed that they had been driving a green van similar to the one described by law enforcement, and this information had actually been submitted to police on multiple occasions, including by one individual following up a decade later. This resulted in police checking out the lead again, determining that the two men had left town shortly after the Springfield 3 had gone missing, and did indeed work for a concrete company in Webster County. That July, investigators obtained a search warrant and searched a rural area in Webster County, where the concrete company had once been located. Despite cadaver dogs finding two suspect areas, nothing of note was found after multiple digs and extensive searches at the site. Authorities would conduct a similar dig in March of 2003 in an area south of Cassville, not too far away from Springfield, using backhoes to dig up the terrain there. That extensive search, however, failed to turn up anything, despite multiple anonymous tipsters pointing investigators to this specific stretch of land near the Roaring River. This location had also been the site of a similar tip back in 1996, in which someone had claimed the three women were buried on the property under some scrap metal. A woman that spoke with police at the time claimed that not only had the three women been abducted and buried there, near Cassville, but that the van they had been abducted in had also been buried. However, it's not believed that any such van was found during this dig. But certain evidence was recovered and sent off to be tested at state crime labs, the details of which were sealed by a circuit court judge in Berry County. That same year, 2003, saw an old farmhouse near Mount Vernon searched by authorities following the discovery of a young woman's bones. She was described as being between 19 and 33 years old, was right-handed, stood between 5 feet and 5 feet 2 inches tall, and sadly, no skull or pelvis was found. At the scene though, police found an inexpensive chrome-plated copper band that had been commonly manufactured in the 1940s and 1950s. Yet, DNA testing would later rule out a match to any of the Springfield 3. Springfield Police Lieutenant Rich Headley told reporters at the time, "I continue to hope that one day we'll receive the lead that really counts." At this point, investigators had spent countless hours looking into this case, exploring more than 5,000 tips, searching through hundreds of fields and marshes, and following leads into 21 different states, including some foreign nations as far away as Germany. Despite relaunching the investigation in 2001, however, those detectives would end up reaching the same roadblocks that their predecessors had encountered, a recurring problem with this investigation over several decades. In 2006, a collection of amateur sleuths began urging police in Springfield to look into a parking garage near Cox Health, a large healthcare facility near the Holston Cancer Center. The structure had been built a short time after the Springfield 3 had disappeared in the early 1990s, and this group had begun organizing online in an effort to draw attention to it. Kathy Baird, a retired reporter from the region that had become a prominent crime blogger, had become their point person in Springfield. Her blog can still be found at crimesceneinvestigations.blogspot.com today. Kathy Baird helped oversee this group's effort to scan the parking garage in question, using ground-penetrating radar to analyze the soil underneath the concrete structure. Using GPR, this group reportedly produced video showing that there were 3 patches of disturbed soil several feet underneath the concrete, which they alleged were consistent with the buried bodies of the Springfield 3. They had then begun petitioning for the Springfield Police Department to use this information to dig up that section of the parking garage and search for the women's bodies. The SPD, however, would reject their proposal, stating that there was no credible evidence pointing to the bodies actually being there, that this was little more than a hunch made by some people online without any credible information. And to the Springfield PD's credit, there were some credibility problems with this information. Namely, that the origin of it, which had led this group to this parking garage in the first place, was a psychic who claimed that the spirit of Stacy McCall had guided her to this location in a vision. Kathy Baird and the others would claim that they had other anonymous tips pointing them to the parking garage, but Springfield detectives, starved for leads at this point, did not find any of these tips to be credible. When speaking to officials with Cox, the healthcare provider that had built the garage, reporters learned that the concrete structure had been built many months after the Springfield 3 had gone missing. To be exact, construction started in September of 1993, more than 15 months after the disappearance of the 3 women. Cox officials said that the soil beneath the garage had been treated and prepared before the parking garage was built, as they wouldn't have wanted any tree roots or other obstacles in the soil disrupting the concrete building months or even years later. And they insisted that during this process, they would have found the bodies if indeed they had been buried there. When asked about the patches of disturbed soil underneath the building, which this group of online commenters claimed might have been bodies, Cox officials claimed that they were also consistent with tree roots, limbs, or other normal debris in the soil. Nothing about them indicated bodies. It was also learned that the individual this group recruited to conduct the ground-penetrating radar test of the soil underneath the parking garage, Rick Norland of Paolo, Kansas, was using a device that he himself had designed. And even then, while this group believed the disturbances he noted may have been bodies, Norland himself stated that his findings were inconclusive, that they could have been bodies, maybe, or they could have been nothing at all. When questioned about this, then Greene County prosecutor Darnell Moore told the Springfield News Leader, "If the expert had told us the only thing the disturbance could be was bodies, we would have dug it, but he couldn't. He said it's just as consistent with concrete or rubble being removed to prepare the soil for concrete. Absent any reliable information there are bodies there is no reason for digging up the concrete floor of the garage. I can't get a probable cause search warrant on the basis of a psychic vision." When asked for comment themselves, Cox Health would state, "Digging up the area and subsequently reconstructing the structure would be extremely costly, and without any reasonable belief that the bodies could be located here, it is illogical to do so, and for those reasons SPD does not intend to. Investigators have determined this lead did not be credible." Over the years, this issue of the parking garage has become a contentious issue in online circles, with many commenters believing that it provides one of the most promising leads in this long-standing cold case, while others, myself among them admittedly, believe that it is little more than a red herring, born out of nothing but a misplaced sense of suspicion. Many seem to think that there's no harm in checking, but unfortunately that's not quite how the world works. Maybe if this was a random dirt pit somewhere, I'd say, why not, go dig it up. But it's not. It's a concrete structure that someone would have to go out of pocket to both deconstruct and then reconstruct. And I don't know, this information pointing to this being a potential burying site is sketchy at best. At worst, it's just absolute gibberish thought up by an overactive imagination, and I would rather not have our criminal investigators chase down every wild goose chase offered up by psychics. Maybe that makes me sound like a bit of an asshole, and if it does, apologies, but I happen to side with investigators on this one. If I'm mistaken, I would be happy to be proven wrong. But after watching this parking garage saga unfold online over the past decade or so, and then doing my own deep dive over the last month, nothing to date has given me any indication that Sherrill Levitt, Susie Streeter, and/or Stacy McCall may actually be buried there. We will be right back after a quick word from the sponsors that support this show. In 2007, at the 15-year mark of the investigation, police officials admitted that they had continued to struggle with the Springfield 3 case. Despite relaunching the investigation in 2001 and going through several starts and stops since then, investigators had again reached the end of the road with empty hands. SPD Sergeant Mike Owen told the Springfield News Leader that June, "It's in a lull again. We just don't have anything solid in terms of evidence or testimony to lead us any further right now. Major Steve I. James, who had overseen the detective division since 2001, stated, "The answer to the question is not contained within the 5,000 plus pages of investigative reports. It's been looked at by enough sharp people. It's not a situation of having a smart person look at the file and figure it out." At around this point, another suspect showed up, and he was a name that had been loosely linked to the case very early on. And again, it is worth pointing out that there seems to be nothing definitive pointing in this individual's direction, but the crimes he committed in the same area at around the same time gives many pause that he may have had some involvement. And considering what we know of him and his actions, it's hard to believe that police never once seriously considered him a suspect in the Springfield 3 case. But to tackle his story, we need to first back up quite a few years, to June of 1985, 7 years before Sherrill Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall disappeared. A separate story would begin to unfold in Nixa, a small town about 12 miles south of Springfield. On June 17, 1985, a young woman named Jackie Johns was last seen leaving work at the Nixa livestock auction at around 11 p.m. She was seen dropping by a gas station nearby, and her vehicle was later found abandoned along the side of a road, roughly 1 mile north of the livestock auction, at around 6 o'clock the following morning. One of her car doors was left open. Jackie's purse and keys were still inside the vehicle, and a small amount of blood left on the back seat led to the belief that something terrible had happened, that Jackie may have been forcefully abducted from her own vehicle. That suspicion was confirmed when her unclothed body was found just days later, pulled from nearby Lake Springfield by a pair of fishermen that found her just after 8 a.m. on Saturday, June 22nd. An autopsy revealed that her cause of death was a severe blow to the side of her head, believed to have come from a tire jack. She had also endured multiple facial injuries and had been raped. In the immediate aftermath, investigators struggled to build a case against anyone, but they undoubtedly set their sights on a certain suspect early on. Witnesses had seen a vehicle parked behind Jackie John's vehicle at the gas station she visited before her abduction, and separate witnesses saw a similar vehicle parked behind hers on the road where her vehicle was later found abandoned. That vehicle belonged to 27-year-old Gerald Carneahan, the heir to a prominent company in the region called Springfield Aluminum and Brass, and he worked there as their director of industrial sales. As such, he was well on his way to becoming a well-known and influential member of the community. So police suspicion in him for the Jackie Johns case soon became the talk of the town. Police questioned Gerald Carneahan early on, and during their conversations, he reportedly lied about his whereabouts on the evening of Jackie John's abduction and murder. Weeks later, investigators believed that he was trying to flee the country by booking passage to Taiwan. Carneahan would claim this was a simple business trip. Regardless, he was soon arrested on a warrant for felony tampering with evidence, prosecutors claiming that his false testimony was tantamount to tampering. A grand jury impaneled months later failed to hand down any indictments against Carneahan for murder, but his stepdaughter was later charged with perjury in connection with testimony she gave to that grand jury. She was later acquitted of those charges, and the case against Carneahan was similarly thrown out during trial by the judge, who ruled that he had not altered any physical evidence, thus nullifying the lone charge against him, tampering with evidence. Darnell Moore, the prosecutor for Greene County years later, would say about Carneahan, "He was born in a wealthy family and could hire the best defense attorneys you could find." Gerald Carneahan remained the primary suspect in the Jackie Johns murder, but investigators struggled to build a case against him. They had very little physical evidence, and what evidence they had wasn't very useful, at the time at least. More on that in a bit. Years began to pass, and in March of 1993, Gerald Carneahan made local headlines yet again when he was charged with the attempted kidnapping of 18-year-old Heather Starkey on a Saturday morning. Starkey, still a high school student at the time, was walking to a friend's house that morning when Carneahan pulled up beside her. At first, he asked if she needed any help, but then he soon tried to pull her into his vehicle, a white Chrysler LeBaron. Starkey was able to break free and run away, seeking help at a nearby convenience store. A witness nearby wrote down the license plate number, leading police directly back to Gerald Carneahan. Investigators soon learned that months beforehand, Carneahan's wife had sought a restraining order against him. She had claimed that he was a drug addict and an alcoholic with a violent temper, who had not only gotten physical with her in the past, but had even threatened to kill her. She also painted him as someone whose mental state was slipping, becoming more impulsive and dangerous to not only himself, but others. This would seemingly get confirmed when, following his arrest in 1993, he was let out on bond. In the weeks that followed, he continued to commit several crimes, later getting charged with arson, burglary, and destruction of property, in a strange crime spree that included him trying to burn down a competitor's business and even destroying a neighbor's vehicle. He also threatened to kill himself before firing a handgun in his house, and was taken in by police for an involuntary mental evaluation. During that encounter, he attacked a police officer, and then later threw a cup of urine on authorities. So, yeah, 1993 was quite the banner year for Gerald Carneahan. During his trial for the attempted kidnapping, Carneahan literally tried to use the "I was slipping and started to fall so I grabbed a hold of" the victim defense, which, as you can imagine, did not play to the jury at all. They eventually found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the kidnapping. His sentence was later upgraded to 4 when he was held to account for the other crimes he had committed that year, arson and burglary among them. At around this time, local journalists, citing investigators, began to speculate on Gerald Carneahan's alleged involvement in some other local crimes. Whenever a woman had gone missing or been murdered in a similar manner as Jackie Johns, police began to speculate that Carneahan might have been involved. This included the 1987 slaying of Deborah Sue Lewis, who was kidnapped from her car along US 160 just north of Springfield. Her remains were found later that year in Newton County. This also included the 1989 death of Kellyanne Workman, who worked at a cemetery in Douglas County and was abducted from her workplace while mowing the grass. Her body had been found 10 days later in Christian County. Then, of course, there were the 1992 disappearances of Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall, a strange abduction that unfolded at the same time Gerald Carneahan had started to experience his supposed mental break. Like the other unsolved murders, investigators had no evidence linking Carneahan to the strange crime, but of course, suspicion lingered. Carneahan was released from prison in 1997 after serving out a sentence, and spent the next decade as a free man. But the original case that put him on investigators' radar eventually caught up with him. When the body of Jackie Johns had been found in 1985, a swab of DNA had been logged into evidence. This was a small amount of DNA recovered during a vaginal swab, and authorities were not able to use forensic evidence to determine who it came from at the time. But decades later, in 2007, technology had progressed, and the Missouri Highway Patrol tested the sample, resulting in a positive match. Gerald Carneahan's defense attorney, D. Wampler, later told KY3, "It got down to about 8 millionths of a gram of DNA." After an extensive amount of delays, Gerald Carneahan's trial finally started in September of 2010, and after 6 days of testimony and 13 hours of deliberation, a jury found Gerald Carneahan guilty of rape and murder. The murder came with an automatic life sentence, but the jury recommended an additional life sentence for rape, and that sentence was later affirmed. The conviction has since been appealed multiple times, but the various courts have upheld Carneahan's sentence for murder and rape. He is still incarcerated today, and is almost assured to die behind bars without the possibility of parole. Following the arrest, resident J.P. Normal told the Springfield News Leader about the case of Jackie Johns and the impact it had on the community. "It's like those 3 missing girls from Springfield that still haven't been found. It's just been an ongoing thing." While Gerald Carneahan has never been directly tied to the Springfield 3 case in any meaningful way, their stories have seemed to overlap each other in strange ways over the years. Jackie Johns' murder precedes the Springfield 3 by roughly 7 years, but Carneahan was arrested for trying to kidnap an 18-year-old months after Sherrill, Susie, and Stacy went missing. As I touched on earlier, 1992 through 1993 saw Carneahan in the midst of a deteriorating mental state, with him committing multiple crimes and attempting to take his own life with a handgun, ultimately resulting in him being confined to a mental health facility against his own volition. He was also a native Springfieldian, graduating from the same high school that Stacy and Susie attended, Kickapoo High School. Some online have tried to connect Gerald Carneahan to Sherrill Levitt, claiming that the two were dating before her disappearance, but I found zero evidence to support that claim. That seems to be the type of weird rumor/fanfiction that a certain subsect of the online sleuthing community dream up in the absence of any resolution, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless, Gerald Carneahan has become a favored suspect of many online, due in no small part to the type of crimes we know he committed. On one occasion, he attempted to abduct an 18-year-old alongside a road. On another, he successfully abducted and murdered a 20-year-old late at night, not too far away from where Sherrill, Susie, and Stacy disappeared. His deteriorating mental state in both 1992 and 1993 makes him a prime suspect, and many believe that investigators' original inability to build a case against him in the Jackie Johns murder may have made him feel emboldened to act again. And in that case, it was only a minute trace of DNA that ultimately led to his conviction. If we assume that was his first crime, and he only made a small mistake, is it possible that in additional crimes he was even more careful? Maybe even more prepared, perhaps more willing to take risks, and maybe abduct 3 women from a home? We know that he was kinda losing his shit through this time period, so it's hard to think otherwise. While there are many discrepancies between the crimes Gerald Carneahan committed and the disappearance of the Springfield 3, it's hard to fully eliminate him as a suspect based off of publicly available information. In 2010, a new police chief was elected in Springfield, Missouri, and upon starting the job, he ordered the investigation into the Springfield 3 to be relaunched, yet again. This would lead to a brief surge in new publicity, but that was short-lived. However, it seems like the analysis done on the case file during this time completely reorganized things, modernizing it in a way that had not been done thus far. In 2012, the 20-year mark of the case, a similar push was made to begin gathering new leads. Following a 2-year reorganization of the case file, Springfield police published a dedicated webpage for it, highlighting information about the 3 victims, as well as a potential suspect. That same year, Springfield PD would present their newly analyzed information to a panel of 25 criminal justice investigators assembled by NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Lisa Cox, the police spokeswoman for the SPD as of 2015, told the Springfield News Leader in an email. Several recommendations by the panel were incorporated into the ongoing investigation. Those recommendations received are not items we can publicly release. At this point, investigators had made it clear that there were 2 feasible paths for them to finally wrap up their ongoing investigation. 1. Someone had to come forward. In doing so, they would need to confess to their own involvement or provide information proving someone else's, and lead police to some credible evidence. 2. A scientific breakthrough. Some kind of new forensic testing that would make existing evidence even more valuable. However, seeing how investigators did not have much physical evidence to begin with, no crime scene, no bodies, etc., this seemed like an impossibility, barring, of course, a huge discovery. In 2017, Sergeant Todd King would tell the Springfield News Leader, "How do you wrap your head around 3 people literally disappearing, with no idea where they went? In a lot of cold cases, you can look back and say, this is probably what occurred, you just can't prove it. With this case, anything could have happened. You don't have anything that says they were abducted, they were harmed. It's this big mystery." More after the break. Bart Streeter, the brother of Suzanne Streeter and the son of Sherrill Levitt, is someone that has played a strange role in this saga over the years. At times, he has seemed to be a person of interest for investigators. At others, he has demanded answers for his missing family members, becoming a vocal advocate for justice. I have detailed Bart's story at various points throughout the series, mostly in parts 2 and 4. However, as we now draw closer to the end, I realize that I never quite touched upon why police were so interested in him as a suspect from the very beginning, what had led to his original estrangement from his family. When Bart was just 17 years old, he moved out of his mother, Sherrill's home. A rebellious youth, Bart wasn't particularly close with either his mom or his sister throughout most of his 20s. His aunt, Deborah Schwartz, told producers with People magazine Investigates that despite their familial relationship, the two were not particularly close. She even described him as a toxic personality that she did not respect, who spent most of his early adulthood slumming it with who she described as lowlives. That People magazine Investigates special, which came out in 2019, portrayed Bart as an alcoholic with a violent temper, who had reportedly lashed out at Sherrill in the past. This was what had reportedly caused him to get kicked out of the family's home as a teenager, and as a result, caused him to get, in essence, disinherited by the family. A year or so before Sherrill and Susie's disappearance, Bart had tried to rebuild his relationship with them. Susie was beyond happy to have a relationship with her older brother, but Sherrill was more withholding. For a time, Susie even went to go live with her brother in the summer before her senior year of high school, but Bart began slipping back into his old ways. He got drunk one night, and when Susie asked him to turn down his stereo, he got angry and reportedly pushed her to the ground. After that, she and their mother, Sherrill, had begun to steer clear of Bart, growing a wedge between the family members that had not healed by June of 1992. After his two closest family members disappeared, Bart was questioned extensively by investigators, telling them that on the night of the disappearance, June 6, 1992, he had been drinking with a neighbor of his. This neighbor confirmed that they had been drinking that night, but also claimed that Bart left his home at some point between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m. on June 7th. After this, Bart says he went home and passed out. Bart was then polygraphed, which he reportedly passed. However, even back in 1992, investigators had to wonder to what extent could the polygraph be trusted, since someone under the influence of alcohol may not even remember what they had done. And of course, this goes without saying. Polygraph tests are pretty much bullshit. A useless technology that unnecessarily hampered criminal investigations for decades. But that's a spiel I've made many times before that I don't need to retread. Regardless though, Bart Streeter was seemingly eliminated as a suspect in the case, although Springfield PD have insisted over the years that no one has been ruled out as a suspect. Well, after being questioned extensively and cooperating with the police investigation, Bart Streeter moved out of the area. Throughout his journey, he ended up getting sober for a time and settling down, returning to Springfield a few years later to try and get answers. He would remain on the periphery of the case in the years ahead, speaking out on behalf of his mother and sister on occasion, but he was not a constant figure in the case, a la Janice McCall. Well, in February of 2019, Bart Streeter would make headlines again, and not for anything good. He was arrested for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and attempted false imprisonment in Smyrna, Tennessee, reportedly showing up at a nail salon on February 28th of that year. In the subsequent police report, it was claimed that Bart claimed he was there to pick up his granddaughter, a 15-year-old girl that was at the nail salon, but the girl apparently did not know Bart Streeter and refused to go with him. Cops were called and Bart was apprehended nearby, taken to the county jail on a $4,000 bond. The Streeter family, which had begun operating a blog highlighting information in the Springfield 3 case, would refute the allegations that Bart had attempted to kidnap anyone. On the blog, they would claim that the entire incident was just a big misunderstanding, and that the surveillance footage from the business showed Bart arriving and shaking hands with the owner, then reportedly asking whether or not the granddaughter was one of the salon's patrons. However, in this blog, the Streeter family did address Bart's longtime issue of alcohol abuse, something he had struggled with for a while. While I personally don't have any reason to believe Bart Streeter is still a suspect in this case, I understand why others might be wary of him. His troubling relationship with alcohol, his alleged temper when drinking, and his splintered relationship with his mother and sister provides maybe the clearest, or perhaps the only, tangible motive in this case. However, was this enough for him to orchestrate the disappearance of 3 women, 2 of whom were extremely close to him? That, I personally doubt. Before long, the 25th mark of the case came and went, as did the 30th in June of 2022. Now, as I record this in the waning days of 2024, we're closer to the 35th mark of the case than even then, which seems improbable. In the time since Sherrill Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall strangely disappeared, their absence, dubbed the Springfield 3 in press coverage, has been covered in multiple formats. It has been featured in various true crime shows such as America's Most Wanted, People magazine Investigates, Disappeared, and others. Multiple books have been written about it, and it's been featured on multiple podcasts, many of which I'm sure you've all heard or at least heard of. This includes a podcast originally dedicated to this story, The Springfield 3, A Small Town Disappearance, hosted by Anne Roderick Jones, which came out in 2021. That show has since gone on to cover additional crime stories in the region, and has redubbed itself Ozark's True Crime. I have not listened to it yet, but I have heard it is quite good. The Springfield 3 is one of the most defining mysteries of our time, becoming a story that thousands have argued about online for decades. A bizarre cold case that everyone seems to have an opinion on, with most of those that comment about it online having a theory about what happened, who was responsible, where the three women went, what happened. And, to their credit, there's not exactly a lack of suspects. Running down the list that we have explored in the series, we have Bart Streeter, Susie's brother and Sherrill's son, who was a known alcoholic with a strained relationship with his family and a shaky alibi on the night they went missing. Mike Kovacs, Susie's ex-boyfriend that had been harassing her in the months before she went missing, resulting in a restraining order the prior autumn. Dustin Rekla, another of Susie's ex-boyfriends, who along with his friends, Michael Clay and Joseph Rydell, had been arrested for grave robbing months beforehand. Then we have multiple suspects without known ties to the victims, but who are equally suspicious, if not more so. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted armed robber and alleged killer who seemed to toy with authorities and confessed to knowing where the women were buried. Stephen Garrison, a convicted rapist with ties to the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club, who also confessed to knowledge of the case, ultimately using said knowledge to get out of jail before committing a violent rape that sent him right back. Larry Dwayne Hall, a convicted serial killer that traveled throughout the Midwest for historical reenactments, who at one point confessed to killing the Springfield 3 but later recanted. Then there's Gerald Carneahan, a convicted killer and serial abductor that was born into a wealthy Springfield family, whose victims were in the same demographic as Susie and Stacy. In recent years, some online have started to speculate that another local businessman that's well known in the Springfield area had the three women killed and buried in the parking lot of his business. But that is exactly the kind of rumor that is impossible to verify barring some kind of extraordinary evidence. Then we have some of the unknown individuals. The people who were reported to police in the hours or days after the three women went missing, but whose identity remains unknown to the public. This includes the person who made prank phone calls to Sherrill's home just hours after the women's disappearance, which were reportedly sexual or explicit in nature. The person who left behind a voicemail on Sherrill's answering machine, which was reportedly heard by Janice McCall as she attempted to find her daughter. An unknown transient seen near Sherrill's home in the days preceding the abduction. Then there are the multitude of potential persons of interest seen in the area at around the time of the disappearance, including the men who may have been driving an older model green van. This incredible list of potential suspects or persons of interest really highlights what investigators have had to work with over the years. In a case that is so tough to comprehend, where there's no discernible crime scene, where the women's bodies have never been located, etc., having a cast of characters like this doesn't make things any easier. It's very possible that any of these men may have been responsible, or may know something that can lead police to the person who was. But, at the same time, recent history has shown us that the most common suspects are often not it. Think of almost any recently solved cold case. Now think back to whether the person who did it is the one that journalists and reporters or web sleuths had been circling for years, decades even. The odds are that they weren't. When people get away with crimes like this, it's usually because they managed to shake any public suspicion, despite matching the suspect profile to a T. If and when this case ever gets solved, I would not be surprised if we find out that it was committed by a person or a group of people that were never originally tied to it. And as I said earlier this episode, if I am proven wrong, I would be more than happy to admit it. But based on the dozens of crimes that I've covered over the years that have since been solved, the suspect was almost always someone that had never popped up on Reddit, Facebook, or web sleuths. If I was a betting man, that's where my money would go. According to the Springfield Police Department, a $43,000 reward has been established for the location and prosecution of the persons responsible for the abduction of Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall. If you know anything, or think you may know anything, you are encouraged to reach out to authorities. You can reach the Springfield Police Department at 417-864-1751, or the FBI Violent Crime Apprehension Program at 800-634-4097. You can also reach out to Missouri Crime Stoppers at 417-869-TIPS. That's 417-869-8477. The families involved continue to wait for justice to be served in this cold case, which has been haunting them for the past 32 years. Many of them have long since rid themselves of any notion of closure or resolution, with Janice McCall telling People magazine in 2019, "There is not a word called closure in the dictionary for families missing someone. My baby is gone. We want some justice." Janice and Stuart McCall have had to go through the latter half of their lives without Stacy, their youngest daughter, who would now be 50 years old. The same could be said for Sherrill and Susie's surviving family, who have all had to endure the last 3 decades without them. While most have long since abandoned any hope that the 3 women will be returned to them safely, they hope that the person or persons responsible for this strange disappearance will one day be identified and held responsible for their actions. And until they are, the stories of Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall will remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I have been your host, Micheal Whelan. Research, writing, and production for this podcast was handled by myself, as Unresolved is a fully independent production. The music you're hearing right now, the Unresolved theme song, was composed by my friend Ailsa Traves. To learn more about this podcast or myself, visit the Unresolved website at unresolved.me. There you can also learn how to support this podcast through PayPal or Patreon, the latter of which allows you to receive certain bonuses, such as bonus episodes or a producer credit. On that note, I would like to thank this week's producers, who are as follows: Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Ben Crocum, Scott Meesey, Marion Welsh, Jacinda Klass, Lauren Nicole, James Weiss, Astrid Nair, Alex Kalergopoulos, Annie Broad, Crystal J, Stephen Diaz, Heather Fiddler, Anna T, Cece, Marcus Mitchell, and Tabitha Colvin. Thank you all so much. You continue to absolutely rock, and words cannot express how grateful I am for your continued support. Even though this podcast is nearly a decade old, this is still a fully independent one-man operation, and every bit of support truly helps. Even to those of you that don't have the means or desire to support the podcast financially, even spreading the word to friends or family and taking a minute to leave a nice review on Apple Podcast or Spotify, it all really helps, and it is insanely appreciated. Thank you all so much to those who do. This is the final planned episode of not only the Springfield 3 series, but for the calendar year. However, do not fret. I do hope to come out with some update episodes, and maybe even a little Christmas re-release in the coming week. And with any luck, maybe we'll get to release a part 6 of the Springfield 3 series soon. I wouldn't hold my breath, but crazier things have happened, as many of you longtime listeners will attest to. After all, whoever could have predicted the Golden State Killer or Lisk being identified? Maybe there will be a Christmas miracle here. Anyhow, until 2025, which doesn't seem real, it seems like a fake year. Whatever. I hope you all stay healthy, stay happy, and you have yourselves a joyous little holiday season. Bye everyone.